thought of when I was walking around the tables, and here you've got it. You've got Punishing Fire, Grow the Burnwells, you've got some beats in Tarmogoyf, Bloodbraid Elf, Dark Confidant. This is a deck that, has a lot of ground in a field like this, and he's fighting up against one of the premier blue decks of the format, so this should be a good matchup to watch.
Yeah, so this is going to be the second Jund list that we've seen on camera today, but the first one we saw went up against a combo deck, and we really didn't have like a super interesting matchup.
You saw in the sense that he was sitting there shuffling his deck, but...
Well, and like, it went to 3 games and he put up a fight, but like there wasn't much interaction. There were a couple of haymakers, there were some Bloodbraid Elves that cascaded into really good things, and there was some tension about like, will he hit the discard spell that he needs to disrupt the combo deck?
Right.
But there wasn't a back and forth of fighting creatures or sweepers or anything like that.
So we're off to the races. Greg leads with the turn 1 Wasteland, which is kind of an odd land to lead on, but I guess he might want to hit Joe's turn 1 dual land. But Joe does not play turn 1 dual land. He just plays an island and passes back.
Yeah, and it's possible that he played the Wasteland as protection from Wasteland because because he wanted to play a turn 2 play but wasn't sure what he wanted to fetch.
Or also just bluff his deck too.
Yeah. So
Greg fetches out of Bayou, and it looks like he's going to tap 2 to play Sylvan Library.
All right. So Sylvan Library, if this resolves, and Joe would fight over this if he has the opportunity to fight over this, is going to put a lot of pressure on Joe by giving Greg a card advantage engine. Joe tends to win the game, either through big chunks of damage from his Entreat the Angels or with Jace Fate Sealing. So the first 12 life or so that Greg has doesn't really matter that much.
Right, they're all just ancestral recalls, basically.
Yeah.
And Joe notices that and spell pierces that right out of the gates.
Yeah. And so Joe's sort of setting the tone here of, I'm not going to let you have card advantage permanents. I'm going to fight you, I know exactly what I need to fight you about, and we're going to 1-for-1 this until my card advantage engine comes online.
Right, so Greg casts a Thoughtseize here, and Joe brainstorms in response to help put the cards he really wants out of range. So something that's important to know about this matchup is it's kind of your prototypical control deck versus mid-range deck, and the mid-range deck in this matchup kind of wants to be the beatdown deck. They want to get some creatures out, they want to pluck away the control deck's threats with discard spells like this Thoughtseize, but if the game goes really long, Miracles is going to be in a really good spot. I mean, that deck has a lot of power, it can lock you out with a top and counterbalance, and even though Greg has this great Punishing Fire engine, it's not so good against top counterbalance. You can just lock out all the times you want to cast Punishing Fire.
Yeah.
So,
and I talked a little bit about, how there's a card advantage engine, and it's a weird card advantage engine for Joe in that he doesn't draw a lot of cards, but he gets up on card quality through Sensei's Divining Top and through locking out part of Greg's deck with the counterbalance combo.
Right, exactly. I mean, when you have top in play, you're only still drawing 1 card a turn like a normal human playing Magic, but the cards you draw are all awesome because you get to pick up the top 3. So Greg Thoughtseizes away Entreat the Angels there, leaving Joe with 4 lands and a Spell Pierce in his hand. But don't be fooled, he just brainstormed to put 2 back on top, so he kept some good ones almost surely. And look, he kept Counterbalance, which is going to be huge in this matchup. And Greg lands a Death Threat Shaman on his turn. So the board is now Death Threat Shaman versus Counterbalance.
Yep. And so Joe's happy to have the Entreat the Angels get Thoughtseized away. It really, it's not doing him very much good in his hand. It's a late game card. He would ideally have liked to have brainstormed it away and shuffled it away. But this works out as well as that.
So looking at what's in Greg's hand, he has the Abrupt Decay, which is crucial here because it can kill the counterbalance, and Joe can't counter it. So the counterbalance's ability, which is usually a crucial part of how his deck wants to work, just won't do anything. Greg can Abrupt Decay it away, and bam, it's off the table. And that's kind of, in Return to Ravnica, we put this card in here specifically to fight Counterbalance in Legacy. Standard implications too, but we wanted a Legacy card that was good against Counterbalance. And it's great to see that's actually how it's playing out here. Greg's going to use the card we made to help fight Counterbalance in his Jund deck, so...
Yeah, and Abrupt Decay and Deathrite Shaman are the 2 cards from Return to Ravnica that have created this archetype.
Right.
Jund did not exist in this form before Return to Ravnica. We had some decks that played Jund colors, but there were things like Aggro Loam that wanted to combo you out with Seismic Assault and Life from Below. Not anything sort of traditional and creature based like this.
So Joe untaps and plays a top, Now, he's got to be feeling pretty good about that top right now with the counterbalance, but little does he know that Greg's got an abrupt decay ready and raring to go for that. Yep, and there it is. Abrupt decay on the counterbalance means that Joe's top will not be doing a lot. Now, do you like casting abrupt decay here, or do you prefer to cast it in the end step somewhere? Maybe Joe manipulates the top cards of his library in a different way than he would have otherwise.
I don't think it really matters that much here. It's fine either way. Like I guess you get a little bit of extra value from Joe, thinking that was the plan by doing it in the end step, but he's not going to radically alter what he's doing as a result.
So speaking of Deathrite Shaman, and the crucial card from Return to Ravnica, gives this Jund deck great reach against the control decks, because you put it down for 1 mana like Greg's done. He just exiled an instant to deal 2 damage to Joe, and every turn he can just tap it and pay 1. There'll be plenty of instants in the graveyard, I'm sure, instants and sorceries, and Joe's life total is going to fall by 2 every turn until he can get that card off the board.
Yeah. Deathrite Shaman's really similar. Well, it's similar but very different from another accelerator that costs 1 green mana, Noble Hierarch. And in both cases, like there's a lot of value in a format like Legacy to getting a turn ahead of your opponent in mana, but for the most part, it's not worth a full card to do that. Whenever you can get a little additional benefit from it, though, we've seen that that's been worthwhile. So Deathrite Shaman has been tremendous that way because it turns into a threat in the late game. It can get you some incidental life, and it lets you manage graveyard decks a little bit.
Right.
So you get some incidental value from that. Noble Hierarch is similar in that it gives you that crucial +1/+1 that helps you win a Tarmogoyf war, which was the big deal when Conflux first came out.
Right. So Greg plays Liliana of the Veil, and Joe tops in response, and ends up cracking the top to find Force of Will to force that Liliana off. Liliana is huge in a matchup like this because Joe really needs all of his cards. He will have card quality from Sensei's Divining Top, but he really needs to be able to keep cards in his hand to have good reactions, and Joe understands that and makes sure that Liliana does not resolve.
Yeah, just like Sylvan Library, it's a source of card advantage for Greg, and Joe really cannot afford to fall too far behind in that card advantage race in this matchup.
So Greg, once again, going to work with that Deathrite Shaman, exiling a instant or sorcery and dealing 2 to Joe. Now, another player has a lot of cards in their hand right now, but as we mentioned before, top is just going to make sure that Joe draws the cards he wants over and over, especially in conjunction with those Onslaught fetch lands, Flooded Strand. He can look at his top 3, and if there's nothing good there, he can just shuffle his library and see a whole new 3 cards.
Yep. So, looks like we've drawn a Maelstrom. Greg has drawn a Maelstrom Pulse for the turn. And I think he might have had a Dark Confidant in there already, but he's holding off on that and passing the turn back.
Alright, so Joe does just that, as we mentioned with the Flooded Strand. So he looks at his top 3, didn't like any of his options, and now he's just going to shuffle his library and get 3 fresh looks at the top of his library, maybe looking for Entreat the Angels. Now, Entreat the Angels is interesting here. Joe might be like, yes, Entreat the Angels, that's just the card I want, but in reality, Greg can just Maelstrom Pulse all those away. He's got one of his answers. He's playing only 1 Maelstrom Pulse, so he drew his 1 bullet against that. Of course, Joe could also just be looking for a counterbalance to help block out whatever Greg's trying to do.
And Joe Lossett is a really methodical, careful player. I would expect that if he had the opportunity to float and treat the Angels on the top of his library, he would continue to do so until he was sure that it was going to resolve, or until he really needed it. He's not in a position here where he has to start, killing Greg, and so based on the way I've seen him play in the past, I'd imagine that he's going to be really conservative at the top and with any entreats that he finds.
Right, and Joe's got plenty of time too. I mean, there's no clock on him. He's got the 2 damage from the Deathrite Shaman every turn, but he's in good shape otherwise. Yeah. And you'll notice he's looking for the cards he wants. He saw 3 cards. There wasn't anything there that he liked, so he just cracked another fetch land. And now he sees some juicy cards. He sees 2 counterbalances in his top 3 cards off this top. I mean, he can pretty safely set that up next turn. And even if Greg does find another Abrupt Decay, he will have another counterbalance waiting in the wings to cast against
I think the 3rd card there might be a Brainstorm, so that's a card that synergizes really well with counterbalance.
Right. And there's the counterbalance. So now Joe has assembled his dynamic duo of Sensei's Divining Top and Counterbalance. The way this works, top lets you look at your top 3 cards and rearrange them. Pretty good. Counterbalance says whenever your opponent casts a spell, you can reveal the top card of your library, and if it has the same converted mana cost, you just counter the other spell. So with the manipulation of the top card of your library, plus the ability to put top on top of your library in a pinch, your opponent is going to be in a rough spot to ever resolve any spells. And Joe plays Misty Rainforest there, which also is great because once again you can shuffle your library, get the cards you want, or just make sure the converted mana cost you want is on top of your library.
Yeah, and so the counterbalance engine here really is another form of card advantage in that it invalidates large swaths of Greg's deck without having to spend cards to do that. That said, it is not an absolute lock against Greg. Greg has some 4 mana cards. He's got Bloodbraid Elf in his deck, and he also has Liliana Veil, a 3 mana card. And typically, it's pretty easy to float a 1 and a 2 drop on the top of your deck with a Sensei's Divine on top to be able to counter those. But being able to find a 3 and a 4 and then float all of those things is difficult. So Greg is not locked out of the game.
Right, especially with Joe. I mean, if he finds a 4 like a Jace, he's just going to play the Jace. I mean. So it looks like Joe, is that a Swords to Plowshares there?
I think it's actually a counterspell.
A counterspell, okay.
But either of them, is a useful card for him. Joe will eventually find a Swords to Plowshares to deal with that Deathrite Shaman. He's not worried at it at the rate that it is.
And now to the viewers at home, you might be thinking, oh man, 2 damage every turn, that's adding up. Joe's already at 11. But in reality, Joe has tons of time here. I mean, the Deathrite Shaman dealing 2 a turn, I mean, Joe's getting the best pick of the cards he wants every single turn. So, all right, so Greg fires off a Thoughtseize, and Joe has a Brainstorm in his hand. So, if you're Joe, do you just top here and try and find a way to counter that Thoughtseize?
So, definitely if it was a Swords to Plowshares and not a counterspell, you would just top and put that on top to counter it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it looks at his top 3. It doesn't need a counterspell. Looks like Joe's playing the white border special with as many white border cards as he can, so that counterspell also white bordered.
He has a Disenchant in his sideboard that definitely threw us for a loop earlier. So at this point, he's going to flip the Sensei's Divine top to draw a card that puts the Sensei's Divine top on top of his library. Then it gets revealed to counterbalance, countering the Thoughtseize.
Right, exactly. And Joe still has that Brainstorm in his hand, so if now Greg was using that to kind of lead the way to get like say a Dark Confidant like he just cast onto the battlefield, Joe can now cast Brainstorm, put a 2 on top of his library, and counter whatever Greg just cast. So that's looks like what he's going to do.
Yep.
He's going to Brainstorm, draw 3, probably dump the Counterbalance back directly on top of his library, and get that Dark Confidant off the table.
Yeah. So he's keeping the Counterspell and the Sensei's Divine top in his hand. This way, if he needs to cast the counterspell, he's recovered the top. He's not going to shuffle it away with his Misty Rainforest.
Right. And I'd definitely say Joe is in the leading position right now. He still has to be a little worried about that Deathrite Shaman, but he's cracking Special Land here. He's going to find 3 more cards, and it's only a matter of time until he finds the Swords of Plowshares, or even just a Terminus to get that guy off the board. And he's going to be in a really good position to take control of the game after that. Yeah. But like you said, there are some cards that Joe can't counter, so Bloodbraid Elf could still be really strong for Greg Peloquin here.
Yeah, and this is a point that Joe would be happy to, if he found and Entreat the Angels at the top of his deck, he'd be happy to play it, be able to kill Greg before the Deathrite Shaman actually becomes an issue.
So Joe tops there, and he finds a Force of Will, a Jace, and is that and a Mystic Gate.
Yeah.
So that Jace is going to be pretty huge.
Yep. Mystic Gate is Joe's new dual land of choice that doesn't get caught by choke.
Oh, that's really awesome. So you can turn tapping a Plains into 2 blue mana, so you can cast cards like Jace or Counterbalance or something like that.
Yep.
How many Mystic Gates is he playing?
I believe it's just 1. He used
2 Mystic Gates, actually.
2 Mystic Gates.
Wow, he leveled up from just the 1. That's pretty exciting.
I guess, so the importance of having 2 there is, combined with the 2 Plains, he can cast Jace and all of his non-Force of Will spells without tapping any of his islands.
Right, and speaking of Jace, there's Jace right there.
Yep.
And this Planeswalker is quite exciting. So, one of the most powerful ones printed. It was banned in Standard at one point, and here it comes down, and it's going to bounce that Deathrite Shaman, getting it off the table, and that means Joe's going to be able to counter it when it comes back down off that counterbalance.
Yep, and this is a place where Joe is able to deal with the Deathrite Shaman, basically expending 0 cards.
Right.
He's each turn that you have Jace in play is maybe equatable to a card, So there's virtually a card that's been spent, but in terms of the permanence he has in play, cards in hand, he doesn't have to do anything to do that. It looks like Greg is going to be casting his Maelstrom Pulse here. I'd imagine that he's going to go after Jace with it. This is one of the few times that he's going to have an opening for it. The top is on top of Joe's library. He's unlikely to go to shuffle away in hopes of hitting a blind 3.
Right.
And Jace is a win condition for Joe.
Right. I mean, you could think about the counterbalance because that would get the combo off of the board, but Jace is just going to crush Greg on its own if he leaves it alive. So Greg gets rid of that Jace. Oh, and now he drew Liliana of the Veil. Now that's pretty powerful here. He's going to be able to. It looks like it's going to resolve because Joe's card in his hand is a counterspell, so he could up it right away. And both players discard their cards. Okay, so now they're both playing off the top of their library, except Joe's going to have a Sense of Divining top, which means that he's doing anything but, really.
Yep. And while Liliana, is a planeswalker, her ultimate is not that devastating in this matchup, and Joe has the opportunity to come up with a way to deal with it very quickly and win this match very quickly. And if he finds the Last Entreat the Angels before Liliana goes ultimate, he will win very easily. He also has additional outs in the form of Venser, Shaper, Savant, and perhaps even Vendilion Click to that Liliana.
Oh, and then Greg draws another saucy card. Bloodbraid Elf off the top is going to do a lot of work. If you're Greg Peloquin, interesting question. If you're Greg Peloquin, at what point do you wasteland that Flooded Stream?
I think I maybe do it if the top gets on top of the library again.
Right, and that way, because normally, Wasteland and Flooded Strand not so hot, they just sacrifice it in response, but if you catch the Miracle deck, which is manipulated on top of its library at the right point, you can just straight up kill their land. Now granted, maybe Greg needs to land more, but when he's playing off the top of his library, he's probably not going to do a lot with his 6th mana.
So Greg has been setting up for a couple turns. He had that Maelstrom Pulse, he knew that he was going to need to use it at some point, and he knew that he was going to want to cast a spell at the same time. So his mana has been valuable up until now, but at this point in time, he does have some freedom there.
Okay, so it looks like Joe, is that an Entreat the Angels he just found on top of his library? It was black bordered, so that's a good sign for finding Entreat the Angels. So I think they were discussing there for a second about how Cascade interacts with Counterbalance, because even if you counter the Bloodbraid Elf, Cascade still happens.
Yeah, so you have 2 triggers that go on the stack. The active player's trigger goes on the stack first, then the non-active player's trigger goes on the stack, and then you resolve them in reverse order. So the counterbalance trigger has to resolve before the Cascade trigger.
Okay, so both of Greg's spells resolve. Oh, it wasn't Entreat the Angels, it was Terminus. So
that seems like a fine way to deal with those 2 cards.
So Terminus deals with it single-handedly. Now, if he had left Wasteland up, I would have definitely Wastelanded that Flooded Strand there, I think, but ends up not doing that. So it probably won't matter in the long term, but just a small little thing. Yeah. So Joe draws his top, recasts it, leaves him there, and Greg's upping that Liliana, but still, as you mentioned, the ultimate is not even that strong here. You can maybe break up top and counterbalance, but he's probably just going to flip the top in response.
Yeah, so the one interesting thing about that is that if we do ultimate Liliana before the piles are chosen, is the last opportunity, or are made, is the last opportunity Joe has to activate abilities like the top. And so there's some possibility that Joe might mess up that interaction. I kind of doubt it, but that's the sort of thing that I would expect as a possibility of a player of a lesser caliber than Joe Lossett.
Right. I mean, you could split them lands versus counterbalance or something just to get the counterbalance off the table.
That would be a pretty ridiculous split, and I guess you would keep your 7 lands in that situation.
Land. So Joe finds a Jace off the Sense of Divining top, and now Joe's in a really strong position. He's got an active Jace. Greg has nothing going on but a Liliana, whose ultimate isn't even that threatening. And Greg's found himself with his back against the wall. He needs to draw some strong cards here. Another Bloodbraid Elf would go a long way. If he draws another Bloodbraid Elf here, it could really change the pace of this game. But if Greg draws some blanks, he's going to quickly fall behind. And it looks like Joe Fate Seals using that Jace.
Yeah. I believe the ability when you use it on yourself is called Scribe.
Oh,
That's the keyword.
Sorry, I thought he targeted Greg. I was looking at these deck lists.
No,
my mistake. I agree. Okay, so Greg wastelands down that Tundra.
So draw for the turn. I think we're replaying a top.
Yep.
Yeah. And so what happened earlier was Joe used both of the abilities of the top at the same time. He responded to the look at the top 3 cards with the flip to draw a card in order to put the top on top, getting the Jace, and then put the top second down so that he could get rid of the junky card on top.
Right. Tricky little play. You can tell Joe is no stranger to this deck. In fact, I think I've seen him play it before at a StarCity Games Open in Seattle.
Yeah.
All right,
he was here last year for at least one of the 2 opens that we had.
So he tops and he found a Vendilion Click on top of his library. So he's going to be in a pretty good position to start dealing some damage to Greg and maybe even make sure that Liliana doesn't go ultimate.
Yeah. And it looks like Joe is one of his game plans may be, I'm going to ultimate Jace and make your Liliana's ultimate irrelevant. Or at least force you to, do something other than put my lands and my counterbalance in separate piles.
Right.
And so Greg has a tough decision here. First, does he want to ultimate Liliana right now,
and
or does he want to make a discard? And then second, how the heck do you split this up?
Right. So first, I think Joe's got to crack that top in response, right? I don't think you want that being part of the what's going on.
Yeah, so I think you probably. So you definitely flip the top. The question is whether you spin the top first.
You probably do spin the top because you're not going to use that mana for anything else anyway. Probably. Yeah. I mean, he's got a Vendilion Click, so that's another wrinkle, right? Does Joe, what does he want to do with that Vendilion Click? And he probably just wants to crack the top, draw the click, and then have it in his hand and float mana beforehand so we can cast it no matter what happens to his land.
Yeah, and one thing that he could consider, we have an ability on the stack, so any sorcery speed thing that is in Greg's hand, he could prevent Greg from casting by flipping the top, getting the Vendilion Click, and then playing it to see what is in Greg's hand. And if he has a threat that actually matters, he can get rid of it. If he doesn't, then he has that much more information when evaluating the split that Greg offers.
Of course, the downside to that is the Vendilion Click becomes part of the split too.
Yeah, so, but he doesn't need the Vendilion Click other than to get the information. He's not going to win through damage. He's going to win through Jace in all likelihood.
All right, so it looks like he's going to float his mana, and he is not cracking his top.
Interesting.
Wow, that surprises me. Okay, so now Greg has to figure out how to split the crucial 3 cards, and then he'll figure out what to do with those lands. So I think you've got to split up top and counterbalance, right?
Yes, but if you do that, you have to put the top in the same pile as the Jace, because the Jace Brainstorm ability gives you some ability to control the counterbalance.
Okay, so the other important thing is Joe only has 2 white sources. So maybe you can try and hurt Joe's ability to cast white mana somewhere. There are so many angles to consider here, and Greg is going to have to figure out... All right, so the piles look like this. Ooh. Wow. Jace, top, counterbalance, planes versus all those lands, and Joe's like, all right, well, I'll keep the lands, Jace, counterbalanced. So Joe will keep planes, counterbalance, Sensei's Divining Top, and Jace the Mind Sculptor.
That seems a little... Well, I'm not sure if you can actually leave Joe with a land there. Oh,
and he flips Entreat the Angels in response. I didn't see that. I just saw the click. So he flips Entreat the Angels, and suddenly he's going to have some 4/4s to deal with.
Yeah.
I'm curious to everyone at home, how would you have split that up? Tell us at a SCG Live, and curious what you guys thought. I mean, I definitely would have cracked the top in response, but granted, if you don't do that, or I guess with this knowledge, that's why you didn't crack the top in response, right?
Yeah, this is a big surprise, and so...
Surprised everyone.
Joe has put Greg in the unfortunate situation of, having 2 things that he has to race here. He has to come up with a solution for the angel tokens, and he has to be able to deal with Jace.
And Greg picks them up.
It's just too much for Greg.
Right, and he already spent his 1 Maelstrom Pulse. So there we go. Now, granted, we are almost halfway into the round, so that was only game 1. Hopefully we can get the other 2 done in time. Let's take a look at these players' sideboards.
Before we talk about the sideboards, I do want to go back to that decision about flipping the top. One thing that we weren't considering was Joe knew what Greg's card was for that turn because he had Fate Sealed the previous turn. So he actually has a lot more information there and is able to make that decision much more clearly.
Right. I just didn't know Entreat was on top. If Entreat is on top of your library, I think it's pretty clear you actually don't flip there, just because getting those angels is going to be completely brutal. But I didn't see that when he was reordering his library, so alas. Okay,
Yep.
so looking at sideboarding here, let's go over Greg's deck first. So why don't you run off some of the cards you think might be relevant in this matchup?
Okay. Well, so let's just run through all the lists so people can listen at home. We've got 1 Ancient Grudge, 2 Thorn of Amethyst, 1 Umezawa's Jite, 3 Duress, 1 Scavenging Ooze, 2 Nihil Spellbomb, 2 Surgical Extraction, and 3 Red Elemental Blast in Greg's sideboard. We're definitely going to want the 3 Duresses. It hits virtually every card in Joe Lossett's deck, and while Joe has ability to dodge discard by floating things on the top of the deck with his Sensei's Divining Top, a lot of the time he's not going to have the top, and you're going to be able to take the top. And taking the top on the play is really important. We also may want some Red Elemental Blast, but I don't think we want to overload with that. There are still a bunch of white spells that you lose to, like Entreat the Angels, like Terminus, and so Red Elemental Blast is not a solution to everything. So I think we're doing something like bring in 2 or 3 Duress and 1, maybe 2 Red Elemental Blast.
So, and what would you take out if you were doing that? I mean, some of the weak cards in this matchup.
So I think Punishing Fire is clearly a card that, well, actually, maybe not. So Punishing Fire is in the deck to be able to beat the mirror and beat other creature decks. Most of the time, it's not going to be good in matchups like this, but you do need to have some Planeswalker control, and it is a source of inevitability.
Like, I think I would take out the 2 Lightning Bolts, for sure.
Yeah, so the Lightning Bolts are actually a better choice for that. I think we can probably take out the Life from Loam pretty safely. We're not going to be able to Wasteland lock Joe. He's playing 5 or 6 basics, he's playing 6 basics, and you can see how aggressively he fetches for those. So those are 3 cards that you can take out pretty easily, and maybe you shave a Punishing Fire. You don't want to draw a bunch of them.
I was going to say you shave 1, because you want to find exactly 1, but you don't really want 2 in this matchup, I think, just with some Planeswalker control.
Yep.
Let's look real fast at Joe's sideboard and see what he's got going on here. He's got a much more distinct sideboard with lots of 1-ofs. 2 Blue Elemental Blast, 1 Pyroblast, 1 Red Elemental Blast, 2 Misdirection, 2 Rest in Peace, 1 Venser Shaper Savant, 1 Humility, 1 Pithing Needle, 1 Sulfur Elemental, 1 Engineered Explosives, 1 Entreat the Angels, and 1 wonderfully white-bordered Disenchants. Now, what would you want to bring in this matchup versus Jund if you were Joe Lossett? Do you want Misdirection to fight off him to Turok?
So Misdirection is not a card that I really like just for him. You're still trading 2 cards, but you're just costing them 3 in response. I think I'd really want the Pithing Needle and the Rest in Pieces, and
maybe Engineer Explosive.
Probably it. Engineer Explosive. The problem is that Greg doesn't have enough cards with the same mana cost for that to be really efficient. Well, let's come back to that.
We're about to find out, right? So the first play of the game is a turn 2 Dark Confidant by Greg Peloquin, and Joe forces that instantly. Yep. Both players seem to be playing at a much faster pace of play. Just that time is potentially not on their side, especially if you're Greg Peloquin and you're down a game. So.
Yeah, and it looks like Joe has, a fair number of lands, and he's got 3 business spells. It's not really easy to see exactly what they are.
So Greg has a second Dark Confidant there.
And that one resolves.
Joe has led on 2 fetch lands, notably, so he has no worries about that wasteland Greg Peloquin has.
So we have another fetch from Joe, and he's declining to cast anything at this point. And that's not good news for him. Having a Dark Confidant active for more than a couple turns is going to make his job very, very difficult.
Right. Even if Joe manages to Terminus or use swords or something to pinpoint removal, that Dark Confidant, Greg's still going to end up with at least 1 card, if not more, off of that. So Joe's cracking some fetch lands here. Let's see what he's about to do. Vendilion Click. So he cracks all 3. I imagine this is going to be Vendilion Click. I don't know what else it could be.
That seems like the most reasonable thing for it to be. He's ambushing the Dark Confidant, and he just has to hope that Greg doesn't have an instant speed removal spell to kill the Vendilion Click and keep the Dark Confidant alive.
Right. Now, if this goes the way Joe wants it to, he'll not only get the click, not only trade with the Dark Confidant, but he'll pick out whatever Greg was planning to do in his second main phase as well.
Yeah.
Now, this is the time where Punishing Fire could be pretty crucial. If Greg indeed left those in, firing down that click would not only get the fire into your graveyard, but also make sure that Dark Confidant does not perish.
And if I had Abrupt Decay, I would also use that here. The Dark Confidant is incredibly valuable for you.
So Joe targets himself, which is interesting. So he really wants to find something particular. Greg will have none of it and just abrupts decays. Joe tosses Terminus to the bottom of his library and draws a brand new card. We'll take 2 off the Dark Confidant.
Yeah. So Joe knows that if he's not able to get the Vendilion Clique in front of the Dark Confidant, he needs to find something. And Terminus is excellent in his deck. It's terrible in his hand.
Right. It's cool that you can kind of reset your miracles of putting them back in your deck. So when you're shuffling for fetch lands, you just have a higher chance of finding them. So Greg cracks his Verdant Catacombs here. And are we going to see another play by him? Probably. I'd imagine he's doing it now.
Yeah, this might be a Tarmogoyf. It might be another Sylvan Library.
Another Dark Confidant.
Or another Dark Confidant.
Now, the thing at this point is the top of Joe's deck is really scary. If he finds a Terminus, and I imagine if you bottom 1 Terminus, you probably don't have a Brainstorm in your hand. Otherwise, you'd probably set up to Brainstorm it back.
Yep.
Or you probably don't have a second Terminus in your hand. Or, sorry.
I hope he doesn't have a second Terminus.
Sorry. I guess what I should say, spoke a little out of turn there. If you have a second Terminus in your hand, you could draw a Brainstorm and put it back, and then do that. So we'll see what he draws.
So he draws top.
So he does have a Brainstorm in his hand.
Yeah, and he's got 3 white bordered cards, and oh no, he's got another top.
So that's interesting. Why would you bottom? Maybe he must have drawn.
I think he drew the other top.
Must have drawn
off the Vendilion Clique.
That Brainstorm off the Vendilion Clique.
I don't think he has a Brainstorm in hand. I think his hand is 3 lands and Sensei's Divine Top.
Oh, that's a top. Sorry, my apologies.
Oh, no problem. It's hard to see sometimes.
All these white bordered cards, man. Joe, you're killing me. All right, here comes the Sensei's Divining Top for Joe. So Joe's got 2 tops in play.
Yeah, he's going to plan to find a fetch effect at some point to draw a card and shuffle away one of the tops.
All right. So the board for Greg is 2 Dark Confidants versus Joe's 2 tops. I'd rather have the 2 Dark Confidants.
Yeah, and Greg has loaded up. He drew a red Elemental Blast, a Tarmogoyf, and then a Hymn to Turek. So he's going to be able to resolve the Hymn here, empty out Joe's hand, and then he's going to be able to play Tarmogoyf and put Joe, I think, on a 1-turn clock here.
Right, so this is the time, right? Joe needs to find Terminus on the top of his library for those, since it's defining for off the tops, he needs to find Terminus so he can flip it and get rid of those Dark Confidants. Okay, so Joe is down to only 3 lands now after Greg wastelands.
Yeah. It looks like, is that a Disenchant? So Greg chooses not to play the Tarmogoyf there. He's playing around Joe finding another Terminus. Right. The card advantage from the Dark Confidants is going to put him so far ahead that even if he does lose both of them, he's not going to mind.
Right.
And Joe's still under a clock from them.
Right. I mean, even though Joe's getting card quality off the Sensei's Divining Tops, the fact that Greg has like 6 or something cards in his hand right now just puts him in such a good position, even if Joe does find that Terminus.
Yep.
So Joe's down to 6 life after that hit from the Dark Confidants, assuming that he takes it. And then Greg is going to have to make a choice if he wants to play a spell or not.
And at this point, I think he can easily afford to play a Tarmogoyf to make it lethal next turn.
Down comes Tarmogoyf, yep. So now Joe has to find a Terminus. This is the exciting part of Miracles, right? Will you find them? There's an Entreat the Angels.
All right.
That can buy him a little bit of time. I think Greg has Summer Room removal spells in his hands. I think you might have another Abrupt Decay.
Yeah. So I think what we do here is we stack it with a card that we're okay losing on top, and then the Entreat second, so that when Greg attacks, we're able to Miracle out the Entreat.
Just completely ambush him, sure. And you also don't get blown up by Maelstrom Pulse that way either.
Yeah.
So Greg reveals a Liliana of the Veil, a Badlands. Greg down to 8 life, notably. So actually, so Joe has to block with the Angels. Otherwise, he could put Greg to lethal off those Angels. But Joe is forced to block. So he's going to mid-combat, Miracle, Entreat the Angels, make 2 4/4s. No, I guess if he blocks the 2 Dark Confidants, then... Okay, so what happens is Joe makes 2 Angels, and Greg Abrupt Decays one of the Angels.
Yep. And so Joe has to chump the Tarmogoyf here, otherwise he would die.
Right.
And now he has to hope that Greg somehow has 2 Bloodbraid Elves on the top of his deck. And that's the only out that Joe has, I think, at this point.
So Greg duresses Joe and sees a Venture Shaper Savants, which is not going to be enough to fight off the double Dark Confidant Tarmogoyf draw. Yeah, that was really interesting. So if Greg didn't have the removal spell, Joe would have actually won right there, because he would have been able to double block the Dark Confidants, take only 4, and then untap and attack for 8s.
Yep.
But Greg was able to Abrupt Decay one of those, once again using that timely Abrupt Decay in this matchup.
Although it's super likely that Greg has something there, given how many cards he's drawn off the Dark Confidants.
So Joe spins the top again. I think he sees 2 lands Disenchant.
So there was a Jason there. Oh. I do think it was a Disenchant and a land, though. Again, the whiteboarding throwing us off a little bit here. All right, spin the wheel. What do we have?
All right, Deathrite Shaman. It's only going to do 1 point of damage.
Yeah.
And then a land.
Sweat.
So Greg is going to go down to 7, attack, and Joe picks up his cards. So we are headed into a tight game 3. 15 minutes on the clock. Oh, this is going to be exciting. So let's go back to the sideboarding. Now the players know a little bit about what's going on after sideboarding.
Yep.
And someone's going to be on the play, so Joe's going to be on the play instead of on the draw. So if you're Joe, how would you change your deck up knowing that you're going to be on the play for a tight game 3 against Greg Peloquin's Jund deck?
I don't think there are really any cards that change in Joe's sideboarding based on the player draw in this particular matchup. It's not a situation where your opponent is likely to be comboing you out on turn 1 or 2, and so you need to have like Spell Pierces in the main or something along those lines. So I think that's pretty much the same. Before I said I think I might want Rest in Peace and Pithing Needle, and it's worth talking about why I think those are cards that are useful. So Rest in Peace, and you might just play one. Well, actually, so he already has one in the main. You might not want a second one, but the reason why it's useful in this matchup is if Greg does think that the Punishing Fire combo gives him inevitability, Rest in Peace is an answer to that. And it also blanks the 4 Tarmogoyfs in Greg's deck, which are an important part of how Greg is going to get him dead.
In addition to the Tarmogoyfs, it also shuts off Deathrite Shaman, which is quite relevant. Yep. And in the event he ever gets it going, it stops Punishing Fire from doing its thing as well.
Yeah. So there's a lot of collateral damage that the card does in the matchup, and frequently you will actually see people sideboard in Relic of Progenitus in their decks when they're facing a Tarmogoyf deck and a Tarmogoyf Deathrite deck, definitely, because it is a card that shuts off the graveyard and gets that incremental advantage. But the difference here between Rest in Peace and Relic of Progenitus is you can cycle Relic of Progenitus to get the card back. You can't do that with Rest in Peace, which is why you probably don't want more than 1 or 2.
Right, because not only is drawing a second useless, but you really can't afford to have too many dead cards in this matchup. We saw both times that all the resources the players had were extremely crucial, and drawing a dead card could be a nightmare at some point in the game. I mean, drawing the second Rest in Peace could be abysmal.
Yep. And then the Pithing Needle, I think you want to be able to handle Liliana the Veil.
Yep, I agree.
That is a card that you don't have a lot of answers for in your main deck, and while it's not absolutely brutal, it will eventually win the game on its own if unanswered. It takes a while.
Right, and I can also shut off Deathrite Shaman too, which can be relevant. I think most of the time you'll use it on Liliana, but being able to shut off Deathrite Shaman in a pinch is reasonable as well.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Engineer Explosive as a possibility. I think I've actually come around to that a little bit. Joe would like to add a little bit more removal to his deck, and it's fine as a 1-for-1, and sometimes he'll get a 2-for-2.
Well, it's also worth noting we saw that Joe brought in the Disenchant, which I wouldn't have expected, but it was probably for Sylvan Library, which Explosives takes care of as well. But we're about to find out. They're off to the races. Joe leads off with a turn 1 island. Greg has a Badlands and no play, and now Joe just plays his second land, Tundra, and passes the turn.
Yep.
And so this is a situation where I think Greg is going to feel some pressure to get a clock on the board quickly. He knows that, while it's possible for him to win long grindy games, given the time constraints, he's going to need to start working on Joe's life total immediately, as opposed to being in a situation where, he can't really get explosive amounts of damage the way that Joe can with Entreat the Angels.
Sure. So there we see Greg calm and collected as he's choosing his plays. So Greg wastelanded away that land with a Deathrite Shaman. Joe just, and then passed the turn back to Joe. On Greg's next turn now, he's cracking Bloodstained Mire. And do you think we'll see a Dark Confidant here, a Tarmogoyf? What should we expect from Greg Peloquin?
And a 2-drop threat, either of those is excellent. We saw last game how effective Dark Confidant is in this matchup if unanswered. It was as good as a Tarmogoyf. It won him the game, even though it wasn't dealing a lot of damage.
Any given overpowered 2-drop would be pretty reasonable here.
And it looks like we've got a Tarmogoyf in the front of our hand.
So there's a Tarmogoyf, which is a paltry 1-2 right now, but make no mistake about it, that guy grows fast. He gets a +1/+1 for each card type among graveyards, and in Legacy, there are a lot of card types being slung about.
Yep, and it's a card that synergizes particularly well with black and the discard that Greg is running.
Right, absolutely. So Joe plays his 3rd land and just passes the turn back. But of course, 3 mana untapped from Joe could mean a lot of things. It could mean a Vendilion Click, could mean a counter spell. There's a lot of things you have to be worried about. So Greg lands Liliana here, or casts Liliana. Joe, if I were Joe, I'd be trying to make sure that didn't resolve.
Yeah, and Greg, while it doesn't look like he can fight back, he actually has a red elemental blast in hand that he can cast with a Deathrite Shaman. So there's a very high likelihood that it resolves, and in fact Liliana does resolve.
Right, Liliana resolves without any competition from Joe, and he activates the +1, sets the card down that he's going to discard with the Liliana, and now Joe has to figure out which card he doesn't want. And Joe has to be a little concerned here. I don't know what's in his hand, but if he doesn't have an answer to that Liliana, this is the point in the game where it is most effective, because once you get top rolling, you get all the cards you want. But right now, Joe really, really needs to have enough cards in his hand that he can answer the threats Greg has, and that he can assemble all the stuff he's trying to assemble. So there's a Vendilion Click from Joe Lossett, which will be able to at least attack that Liliana if it resolves. Once again, Greg can red elemental blast that Vendilion Click, though. He has that option in his hand thanks to the Deathrite Shaman.
Yep. And Vendilion Click is really clutch here for Joe. He's got his 2nd Treat the Angels in his hand. He wants to get rid of that and draw a card off of it. And he also needs to be able to deal with the Liliana. And I actually don't like Greg letting it resolve there. There's so much benefit from that, and he's going to have to try to write Elemental Blast here.
And speaking of sideboard cards, there's the Rest in Peace we were just talking about. I mean, he's got one main deck, but he's got some in his sideboard as well. Joe's playing the Rest in Peace, and Greg has both Deathrite Shaman and Tarmogoyf.
Yep.
So,
and this is a situation that he's shutting off he's turning 2 cards into a 1/2, and those are really valuable cards in this matchup.
Right. So, and there's the red elemental blast. Joe forces Greg's hand using the red elemental blast on the Vendilion Click, because when all the graveyards are getting removed, Deathrite Shaman can no longer make that mana. I agree. I like hitting the Vendilion Click when it's on the stack, so Joe can't use this ability at all. Yeah. But Greg still has that Liliana active, and Greg's going to tear apart Joe's hand even more with this Duress. So we see Terminus, Entreat the Angels, Disenchant, and Misdirection. Worth noting, there's no other blue card for the Misdirection, though.
Yeah, and this is, if you were able to get that Terminus back on, well, the Terminus is not that important right now. The Entreat the Angels is something that you want back in the deck, though.
So interestingly, Greg takes the Misdirection, and then forces them each discard a card. Greg discards his Punishing or Grow the Burn Willows, and Joe discards a Terminus. So there's another Entreat in Joe's hands. That means he must have warded it in the 3rd Entreat the Angels. Is that correct?
I think we've only...
Because he discarded one earlier on,
Oh, that's right. He did.
So the one in his hands, he's got one on the bottom of his deck and one in his hand currently. Is that correct?
And one in his exile pile, right?
One in his exile pile, yes.
Yeah. And so that actually is a decision that may have been affected. That may have been just for the 3rd game and was affected by the time constraints that they're under.
Making sure that he can win the game in time, because the Punishing Jund deck is a lot more likely to win the game in the time allotted, because it can be a beatdown deck. But the Miracles deck is just going to take a lot more time.
Yep.
And I'm sure they're both very conscientious of the time limit, with only 7.5 minutes ticking down. So Joe tops here, and he finds a Source of Plowshares and 2 other cards I can't quite make out.
The 3rd one is a land of some sort. He is playing that close to the chest.
I think it's Caracas, maybe, is the card in the middle? Yeah, it's Caracas.
Caracas in the middle, and I think it's a fetch land,
yeah.
A Misty Rainforest or something on the bottom. So he's going to draw the fetch land. He can use some additional lands, but really he needs to find something to get rid of that Liliana Veil, and so clearing the top 2 cards of his deck so that he has the top available is really, really important.
Now here's a big question. If you're Greg, do you ult with that Liliana right now?
I think we can wait.
Okay, so Greg draws Abrupt Decay and gets that Rest in Peace off the table.
Yeah. So this is a play that's not going to get a ton of value right now, but it's going to build value later on because the Tarmogoyf is going to get bigger and bigger.
Well, it could be brutal right now because the Abrupt Decay will resolve after Rest in Peace leaves, so it hits the graveyard. And if he activates Liliana, we could see 3 or more card types in the graveyard this turn.
That's true, and having the fetch land there helps a lot.
Right, so yeah, Greg has a fetch land he was holding on to, which is now going to crack. And so now the board state has changed dramatically. So the board is Liliana the Veil at 6 loyalty, Deathrite Shaman, and a 2/3 Tarmogoyf versus Joe's 4 lands, Sensei's Divining Top, and a card in hand. And the top 3 cards of his library could be anything thanks to that Misty Rainforest.
Yep. And making Joe discard here, is an incredibly valuable play because he's not discarding himself, and it increases the size of the Tarmogoyf.
Right.
And that is the last of Joe Lossett's Entreat the Angels. So he's going to have to win through a Jace or a Vendilion Click.
I thought he put one on the bottom of his library, so he has one still in his.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
Right. But even then, it's only 1 left, and that's a long ways away from winning with only 5 minutes left in the game. Now we see Joe top here. I think he's going to put that Swords of Plowshares probably on the top of his library. The question is, do you crack it now to get that Tarmogoyf off the table?
And if you're going to draw the Swords of Plowshares, you might as well crack now so that you can kill it now, take 3 less damage, and replay the top on your turn, right?
Yeah, I think I would do that too. I would just activate the top, Swords that Tarmogoyf, and then try and not take as much damage as you can.
But the question Joe has to be asking himself is, can I win with that line? Just getting Swords Plowsharing the Tarmogoyf is stemming the bleeding, but it's not a way to win this game. This Liliana is still going to be incredibly painful for him.
Right, and I'm not sure on these players' records, but a loss will almost certainly eliminate them, but so will a draw. I'm pretty sure.
Greg may have high enough tiebreakers that a draw does not eliminate him, but Joe Lossett has a draw and a loss already, so he is out of contention with the draw.
Right, so Joe has to be thinking about how he's going to win this game, and maybe you're right. Maybe you just shuffle him up and cross your fingers for Entreat the Angels.
It's a possibility. I'm not sure if Entreat the Angels... Well, no, Entreat the Angels would get him back in the game if he miracled it on this turn.
All right, so he is just going to find that Swords of Plowshares.
Yeah.
And he has to crack Misty Rainforest to do it, so he's even going to lose his top.
No, he does. He floated mana through the Mystic Gate there. So he should have like a white floating or a blue floating, but he chooses to shuffle, I think because he realizes that he has to entreat the Angels the next turn anyways.
Right, so that's what it's looking like. So he fetches out a Tundra, he's going to Swords of Plowshares, shares that Tarmogoyf, and now here's what the game has become about. I think the game, I don't know, maybe sideboarding something different, but as far as I can tell, Joe has to find that Entreat the Angels, and he has to find it now.
And I think what Joe may have done is he may have activated the top and then in response flipped it.
And there's the Entreat the Angels right there. That is what the game is all about right now. So he can Source the Plowshares that Tarmogoyf, untap, get 2 4/4s, and then cross his fingers and hope Greg doesn't find a way to remove them. Now Greg has no cards in hand. He's playing off the top of his library. This game could go either way. With only 3 minutes left, it could go any of 3 ways, really.
Absolutely. So
there we go. There's the Swords on the Tarmogoyf.
So we're going to have 2 Angels versus a Liliana at 7 counters and a Deathrite Shaman. If you're Greg, do you ultimate Liliana and split land versus angel, angel?
I think you.
How do you split that?
I think you split the Angel. So there we go. So Joe draws Entreat, gets 2 4/4s, and now we're gonna have some exciting turns. Greg's got a couple turns left too before he dies to those Angels. So let's see. So Greg draws his card and he peeks at it. Can't quite see what it is.
Just thinking it through.
And with only 2 minutes left, every second is precious. That Liliana ultimate's going to take up time. The decision to ultimate's going to take up time. Greg needs to make a move now.
Yeah. So I think the 2 options for splitting are an Angel and 2 lands and an Angel and 2 lands, or Angel and all 4 of the lands.
I like splitting the 2 Angels in 2 different piles because Greg has 21 life to play with. So he's got a pretty good chance of finding. So he just edicts. Interesting.
So that play makes a fair amount of sense if he's playing to another Abrupt Decay or another removal spell of some kind for the Liliana. And there's a second Rest in Peace.
So Joe plays a second Rest in Peace. Greg's going to nug Joe for 2 real fast with the Swords of Plowshares that's in his graveyard. All right, I don't think Man, this is going to be tight with only a minute and a half left. Joe's got to play fast.
I really think I prefer ultimating Liliana there. If your goal is to kill an angel, you can just split an angel in 2 lands, angel in 2 lands, accomplish the same thing as minusing, but also kill 2 lands.
Right. So Greg takes up Liliana there, discarding a land, and now the angel takes out Liliana. A minute 20 left on the clock. This one is down to the wire, folks.
Yeah.
All right, Greg draws, gets in for 1 with that Deathrite Shaman. Joe sitting at 10, Greg sitting at 21. No play from Greg. Joe attacks with the angel. Greg drops to 17.
Can this get more tense?
I feel like I'm commentating a soccer match.
Joe is fighting against the clock here.
Yeah, a minute 5. A second Deathrite Shaman. All right.
With nothing in the graveyard, it actually does not matter.
Greg gets in for 1, but there's a Venser, which will change the clock up a little more. So now...
So he can...
Joe needs to make a decision fast.
I don't think you even bounce anything. I think you just block the Deathrite Shaman.
All right.
Sure. You have to bounce something, but you force him to recast.
Right. There's that. Okay. 40 seconds on the clock now. All right. Joe just needs to send his creatures in.
Yeah.
Playing quickly is going to be the key to winning for Joe Lossett. All right. So 4 mana. Jace the Mind Sculptor. I would just Fate Seal. Fate Seal past the turn.
Fate Seal go.
You do not have the time. You have to make your decision now, or you are going to lose, or you're going to draw. Yeah. Potentially.
You really want Greg to be the turn 0 here. You need to do this quickly.
So he Fate Seals, sees a Thought Seize. He says, that's fine, keep it. Pass the turn.
All right.
Passes back to Greg.
Joe has secured turn 1. He's going to have 3 turns to kill Greg Peloquin, which is going to be enough if he manages to bottom enough cards. If he can prevent Greg from top decking a removal spell for that angel, Joe is going to finish this.
2-1, and that is time. All right, so turn 0. Here we go. Turn 0, starting on Joe Lossett's turn. Joe is in a great position, but Greg still has a couple ways he can turn around. If Greg draws Abrupt Decay, that could get rid of the angel. So we were just told Joe is turn 1, so maybe our clock was a little off.
Yeah, so Joe's going to get turn 1, turn 3, turn 5. And so one of the options he had was to Fate Seal Greg, but he chose not to do that because Greg has a fetch land out, and if he bottoms a card, if he leaves a card on top, Greg's going to get a reshuffle on that.
Right.
So he'd much rather find a way to prevent Greg from doing something. It looks like he may have done that. It looks like he has a Force of Will in hand.
But that won't stop an Abrupt Decay, though.
That's true.
So I think
it stops a Maelstrom Pulse, and it's close.
So a couple turns ago, the game had shifted to, can Joe find Entreat the Angels, which he did. He found his last copy of Entreat the Angels. Now the question is, can Greg find an Abrupt Decay to get that Angel token off the board?
This is just so down to the wire.
This is crazy. What a great match of Magic, and the time limit has really imposed something unique on this game. Normally there's only 2 angles of attack. It's like, who's going to win? Am I going to win? Are you going to win? I've got all the time I need.
Yeah.
But this is a tight game 3, and the time is up. Will they win in these 5 turns? It's anybody's ball game right now, including no one's.
Yeah, and Greg is definitely playing for the draw at this point.
All right.
He's not going to be able to win in 2 turns, and so his answer needs to be deal with that angel.
All right, is it a Abrupt Decay? All right, so he finds Verdant Catacombs, and it looks like he just packs it in a tight game 3. Wow. Joe Lossett takes the match from Greg Peloquin in just the nick of time, quite literally the nick of time, by the skin of his teeth, by many other metaphors I can make up. Joe is victorious. What a match to watch.